This lecture reviews how land and capital get paid, rent and interest. The lecture will explain the nature of economic rent and how it is determined. We'll define interest and explain how interest rates vary based on risk, maturity, loan size, and taxability. Learn that money is not a resource. It's just a way to acquire capital in order to produce goods and services for consumers. But businesses have to borrow money to make these investments. So we will explain the loanable funds theory of interest rates. We'll also demonstrate how interest rates relate to the time value of money, and explain the role of interest rates in allocating capital, modulating R&D spending, and helping to determine the economy's total output of goods and services. Let's look at economic rent. Economic rent is the price paid for land, or the use of the land and other natural resources. Some businesses don't own the land as part of their business model. They just leased it to extract stuff. So, economic rent is the term that's used by economists to describe how people who own the land get paid. Land supply is perfectly inelastic. The economy only has so much land. They ain't making more of it. Thus, the price, or the economic rent, is determined by changes in the demand for the land. Demand is predicated on two major factors. First, location, location, location. Land that's in the middle of the Arizona desert doesn't get much price, as compared to land in Las Vegas on the Strip or in the middle of Manhattan. Likewise, if the land in Texas has a significant amount of oil below it, or a significant amount of gold or silver, then the economic rent will be higher than the land with nothing but water under the surface. Economic rent is considered a surplus payment. Why? Because increases in the price do not produce increases in supply. The supply is already there. Here we have a fixed supply of land, the red line, perfectly inelastic. Also represented are a few different demand curves, which cause the change in price or economic rent. The demand curve D4 is that Arizona land in the middle of the desert that I was talking about. Probably not worth anything, assuming that there's no California earthquake. D1 would represent land in the middle of the southern district of Manhattan, if you could find any. D2 could represent the demand for land in Oklahoma, where there are significant natural gas reserves. Location and resources. That sets demand and the price. So land is fairly simple to determine. There are areas in the Mideast, etc., where they're reclaiming land, but for the most part, this piece that we've done on land is the essence of economic rent, because they ain't making any more land. Interest is the price paid for the use of money. H.L. Hunt Texas tycoon and conservative Republican activists said, money as money is nothing. I mentioned at the outset that money is not a resource per se. It's what it can purchase. And nobody just provides their money for free. Households want an interest payment if they're going to provide money. Stated differently, interest rates received on money determine the interest income that households get for providing capital to firms. But not all interest rates are the same. There's a range. Borrower risk is a big factor. Lending money to somebody that has an absolute excellent credit rating or has no debt on their balance sheet has one level of risk. Countries or firms that have a lot of debt or have defaulted on payments in the past would have a different level of risk and will pay a higher interest rate. Maturity plays a role. If you're lending to somebody for a year, it has a different interest rate than if you were lending them money for 10 years. The size of the loan matters. Lending a firm $10,000 is different than lending $1 billion. Tax-free bonds have a lower rate of interest than their taxable counterparts. 20-year U.S. Treasury bonds serve as a benchmark for determining the pure rate of interest, a hypothetical interest rate that would serve purely and solely to compensate lenders for their willingness to patiently forego alternative consumption and investment opportunities until their money is repaid. Like I said, it's theoretical. Let's get a little more practical. Reference, the short-term and long-term interest rates for a number of different countries are shown here. Short-term rates, or 3-month money market securities, are rank ordered for the year 2017. Russia, a high-risk environment, has a rate of 10.6%. Switzerland has the lowest at negative 0.33%. Recently, in much of Europe, depositors get charged interest on their savings. That's right, I said savings, not borrowing. Why? Because the governments of those countries want that money to be put to use to buy productive resources, not sit in a bank and collect money. This is quite a different situation than 2008, where interest rates in Europe were about 5%. And you can see that here in the first column, down at the bottom left. Long-term rates, or rates on 10-year government bonds, are typically higher than short-term rates due to the maturity factor. You can see this variance in the final column under long-term rates. Most of them are higher. Russia and Iceland are a little different. They're anomalies, but typically long-term rates are higher, and you can see that here on the chart. A data table on current interest rates is provided in the module. Demand for and supply of loanable funds determines the rate of interest. Let's take a look at this under the initial assumption that there are no financial institutions in the middle between the lenders, households, and the borrower's business. What does the demand and supply of funds look like? The demand and supply of loanable funds is different for different sectors of businesses. Some businesses just have more risk than others. Some sectors are growing more than others. Some need money for a longer period of time. No matter, for all sectors, the supply of loanable funds is upward sloping, like all supply curves. The higher the rate of interest, the more funds will be supplied. The more households will be willing to give up consumption. On the demand side, the curve is downward sloping, like all demand curves. The lower the rate of interest, the more opportunity that firms will have to borrow money and make a positive return on any project that they will undertake. In other words, the return on investment is greater than the interest rate that they will have to pay. Let's look at this graphically. Here we have the upward sloping supply curve. The higher the rate of interest, the more households are willing to supply. Downward sloping demand curve, a reflection of the relative project's return and the rate of interest. Interest is price, and the quantity of loanable funds is supply on the horizontal axis. For example, if the current demand and supply of loanable funds yields an interest rate, the price of funds, of 8%, then projects that returned 16% or at least above 8% would be undertaken. A firm is not going to make investments on projects that return less than 8%. The price, or rate of interest, gets influenced by any changes in demand, shift of the curve, or changes in supply. The interest rate here is not static. Finally, financial institutions do act as intermediaries between households and businesses. They collect the difference between borrowing and lending money. No surprise here. This does not change the loanable funds theory. However, note that the government is not considered in this particular flow, and I want you to think taxes here. But that doesn't take away from the loanable funds theory. As I state on the right of this particular graph, project return is 16% or above 8%, they're going to go and do those projects. If it's below, somebody's not going to borrow money at 8% and get a project approved at 6% return. They'll just lose money. And so you can see how the demand and supply factors influence the equilibrium interest rate and how much demand for loanable funds and supply of loanable funds is made. There are factors that can change the demand and supply of loanable funds. Let's look at changes in supply. The government does collect taxes in the real world. Thus, an increase in household taxes would shift the supply curve to the left, less funds provided. A shift to the right would occur if the attitude towards savings versus spending changed. At every given rate of interest, there would be more savings rather than more consumption. On the demand side, any factor, either a cost factor, a productivity factor, or the demand for the company's product or service that changes the return on investment for a project, can shift the demand curve for funds to the left or to the right. Importantly, changes in business taxes, the political environment, and business confidence can influence the demand for loanable funds. The lower the business tax, the better a project's return will look. the demand for loanable funds will shift to the right. Remember how the European interest rate example earlier in this lecture? Remember that? Business confidence is low in Europe. To compensate for this, interest rates have gone negative. Wow. We have talked about households as the providers of funds and businesses as the users in this lecture. Remember, however, that households borrow credit cards and mortgage debt, and student loans, and businesses lend with any excess cash that they may have. Finally, we cannot forget the government in this circular flow model. The federal government borrows to finance budget deficits. They need to do this when tax revenues are less than expenditures. Thus, demand and supply for loanable funds is a little more complex than the simple example given in this lecture. Just remember that there are more people than just businesses that are in the market for loanable funds, and government is one of the major people that do borrow money. There's a time value of money. This is not a finance course, so I'm not going to get into any sophisticated explanation of the time value of money. Suffice it to say that money is more valuable the sooner it is earned or repaid. Because once you get the money back, you have the ability to earn more, period. That is the principle of compounding in terms of future value. What's the value of $1,000 in 3 years if we're earning 10% and reinvesting it over a 3-year period? Let's review that on the next slide. Assume $1,000 in savings in a savings account at 10% in year 1. At the end of the year, the amount is accumulated to $1,100. Due to compounding, at the end of year 2, it's worth $1,210, and at the end of year 3, $1,331. More than just the $300 because interest was earned on the interest. Firms also look at the present value calculation when evaluating investments. If you're a firm purchasing a piece of productive equipment today, when your revenue stream starts, will determine what value the firm places on the revenue today. Assume 3 different firms each purchase different equipment for the same amount, $10,000. Each firm will earn $2,000 a year over a 3-year window. However, because of market, product, and startup considerations, each firm will not go to market at the same time, but spend the initial investment at the same time. The first firm goes to market immediate and has a 3-year return of 54%, as the second and third years are discounted at 10% each to arrive at a total present value of the $6,000 revenue. The second firm goes to market after 2 years. Assume it takes them a little longer. They make the investment, but for whatever reason, their product doesn't come out. It takes a longer development lead time to get the product and all of the things put together. They're making the same revenue, but due to the present value of discounting, it's only worth $43.90 because it took them 2 years to get to market. They get a 44% return. Waiting for the return costs money. The third firm can only get to market after 5 years due to significant R&D time. The value today is $32.36, or a return of 32%. All else equal, the firm that gets the revenue stream later gets the lower return. That's the present value and the time value of money in terms of the return on investment. Okay, so when we looked at that demand and supply of loanable funds, the thing that came to mind was the immediate return on investment. But many times that return is much further downstream after the investment is made. So really, when you're looking at the demand and supply of loanable funds, it does include the after-tax return and must include the present value of that return in terms of future income streams in terms of a return. I want to spend the final bit of time really emphasizing the role of interest rates in determining the level and composition of new investment. Just as prices ration consumption and demand, interest rates ration capital. Those firms that have projects that return greater than the interest rate will take them, all else equal. Those that do not have projects with a return that is higher will forego. Lower rates encourage businesses to borrow more for investment. The hurdle to make the investment is less. Yet the reverse is also true. The higher the interest rate, the higher the hurdle to overcome. Money's not free. Even if businesses are taking it out of their own accounts and not borrowing. The same rules apply. Who sets the interest rate for the United States? The Federal Reserve Bank is responsible for setting interest rate policy. The details are covered much more extensively in the macroeconomics class. Up until this point, we've been discussing nominal interest rates, or the rates without considering the effects of inflation. So we can see here how this loanable funds theory gets a little more complex when we consider taxes, when we consider present value, and we have to consider nominal and real interest rates, because the real rate affects decisions. Here's a few examples. If the nominal rate of interest is at 10% and inflation is at 8%, then the real rate of interest is just 2%. That is, the nominal rate minus the inflation rate gives you the real interest rate. If the nominal rate is minus 3% and inflation is 4%, then the real rate of interest is negative 7%. Let's look at a United States example. Currently, the short-term interest rate is 1.03% in 2017, the first column. The 3-month inflation rate in the United States is currently at 0.58%. Thus, the real rate of interest in the short term is only 0.46%. In Russia, at the top of the table, the real rate is 9.5%, a little bit different than the United States. As I mentioned, the current data table on real interest rates is located in the module. So we've covered the basic theory here of loanable funds. And in practical terms, we've added some of the complexities that business owners face when entering the market for loanable funds in terms of taxes, real rates of interest, and present value. And we should not forget that government is a major consumer of loanable funds when they are financing deficits.